also a warm welcome from my side to today's webinar about traceability of requirements to test cases in TESSY. I would like to give you first a short overview of the planned contents. First, we will have a theoretical introduction, very short introduction about requirements and what they are good for and so on. And then the main point will be a live presentation of the tool TESSY and how test cases and requirements are linked together and what you can do with such a linkage and so on. And in concluding, we have two very short parts about test means in TESSY, what it is and for what it is good for. And the fourth point here is about a file format for requirements, requirements interchange format, and I will tell you how TESSY can use this format. So let's start with an introduction. This is the motivation about linking requirements to test case, and so the naive motivation is that you can see if every requirement is at least one test case assigned with, so you can verify that there are no untested requirements. And on the other hand, you can see if you have test objects, parts of your code which no requirement is linked to, why does this code exist, or is there a requirement missing? Do you have test cases without a requirement? These 3 points are more or less obvious reasons why you link requirements and test cases together to can answer these first 3 questions. But another important point, which is not so obvious, is what happens if a requirement changes. And then it is important to find out which test cases are involved, which test cases need to be changed maybe, and which test object is affected, which test object needs to be changed for some reason because the requirement has changed. And if you don't have a linkage between requirements and test cases, it's very hard to find out which test case needs to be reconsidered if a requirement was changed. And we will see this, how this is done in TESSY later on in the live presentation. This webinar is not about what is a good requirement and how do I achieve good requirements and how are they structured. For this webinar here, we assume that we have some requirements and that there are good requirements and they are already created. So it's more a technical webinar and not a requirements management webinar. So I hope you don't leave now. And one other point I would like to mention, requirements and functional specification, in my opinion, are very similar. Both specify the behavior of a test object. A requirement is a little bit more formal. A requirement has, for instance, a number, and it has a priority, and it has maybe a linkage to other requirements, and the functional specification is more or less the same, but without the formalism. It describes what a test object should do, so requirement and functional specification are more or less the same if you look at the content and not at the formal things. At least for the webinar here, I take this as the same. Another thing I need to mention before I start the live presentation, a requirement needs to be linked to test items, especially to test cases, and this is of course a manual process, because if you have a requirement and some test cases, a tool cannot know which test case covers a certain requirement. So to establish this linkage between requirement and a test case, for instance, this needs to be a manual process, and we will see how it works in TESSY in the live presentation. Okay, this live presentation is now about to start, and so I switch to the tool TESSY. TESSY is a tool for automated unit or integration testing of embedded software. It's based on the Eclipse Rich Client platform, and you see here the user interface of this TESSY tool. Eclipse means you have different perspectives where views for different tasks are visible. For instance, we have here a perspective for entering test data. We have a perspective, for instance, requirement management, and I start by using this requirement management perspective where I have a requirement explorer, and the first thing is TESSY contains with this requirement management perspective a requirement management system. This means you can enter and define and specify requirements here. I can, for instance, create a requirement document. This is the document is a head of the structure where the requirements are in the root, and you can make chapters here and say this is a chapter about software regs, and then you can make a structure here. You could add a new chapter, but I would like now a requirement, and I give the requirement a name. I do not care about the contents here. It's just to show how such a structure would be made up, and I can make, for instance, a new chapter which is hard. And I can give this also some requirements. And for instance, just to show you how such a requirement structure can be organized, and I have now defined 3 requirements very shortly. What I need to do is I need to confirm the changes and give it a baseline, a version, so I can give it an initial version. And now also, and I can even, for instance, link requirements to each other. I can link this requirement here, and I have now established a linkage between these 2 requirements. If I want, I can see have here a view where I can see the linkage between requirements. And as you've seen here, a requirement has a short description, and I can also give a requirement a longer description. And a requirement has an ID, it has a version, I can give it a priority. For instance, I can say, okay, this is an important requirement. Requirement also has a test mean. We will later see what test means are and how they are linked to requirements and why this is the case. And you see here that you can have linked requirements, and you can see here you can have images for a requirement, so you can have sketches and so on. We will see this later on. You can attach files to a requirement. For instance, you can add, for instance, a PDF file to a requirement, and so extend some meaning of the requirement by everything you want, because you can attach arbitrary files to a requirement. So, and this is what I would like to show you to see how what you can do with requirements, and especially if you want to use TESSY as requirement management system and want to define your requirements by yourself in TESSY. So because I have changed here something, I need to save and recommit, and this would be version 2. And so I can build up requirements for my project, and I can see here the different requirements. Okay, so I think it's now clear how requirements can be built up, and I want to proceed the webinar with some predefined requirements which I can import to TESSY, and therefore I delete here the requirements I have built up until now, and I proceed by importing requirements from a file. I do this by this import menu, and I select a file which I want to import, and if I say OK, the requirements from this file are imported to TESSY, and first I have to commit this, as always. This is the init, and I can now open this document here, and you see that this document includes 3 requirements. If I want to see what the contents of a requirement are, I can double click on this requirement, and you see here this requirement even includes a sketch, an image, but no files are attached, and you have here a short description, a long description, an ID. So the ID is taken from the file, a version number, a priority. This is all imported. The second requirement does not have an image, no sketch available, but the third requirement again has a sketch attached to it. Okay, this was the point that we have imported requirements to TESSY. To be able to link requirements to TESSY, we need some test cases. I could create the test cases manually, but I would like to go the easier way and import some predefined test cases to TESSY, and I use the database restore mechanism. You can save test cases in a so-called TMB file, and I have did this previously, and I now restore the test cases that I have saved in a TMB file in a certain directory. I select the directory here, and I select this directory here, and I select all the TMB files that are inside that file here, and if I say OK, TESSY will import the test cases from this backup file into TESSY, and I now have a set of 2 test cases for a module in TESSY, and we see here the 2 test cases. This is the test data. We have 2 test cases. The test cases have names and they have a description, and now we are able to start linking requirements to test cases. We do this in this requirements coverage perspective, and we have now here the 3 requirements we have imported from the requirements file, and we have here the 2 test cases, and we link now the first requirement to the first test case. This makes sense because of the meaning, the contents of the requirement and the test case, and it makes also sense if we do this for the second test requirement. We link the second requirement to the second test case, and I do this by setting this tick mark here. I leave the third requirement without any test case, and I can now have a look on what I have done by making what is called a planning coverage report. It just shows me at this point of time if all requirements are linked to a test case or not, and in our case it's quite easy to see. We have 3 requirements, and 2 of them are linked to test cases and 1 of them is not, and this will be displayed in a pie chart. I have here made a PDF format report, and I see a pie chart here, and it says, okay, 3 requirements, 2 of them are covered by tests and 1 of it is not covered, and we have also some lists which tells you which requirement has tests, which has no tests, and is also possible by requirement what are the test cases which are linked, and so on. So you can get such a report prior to executing the test. After we have executed the test, we get another report, the coverage execution report. There we see if the test cases we have linked to our requirements are passed or failed, and this gives a slightly different pie chart or a slightly different report. Now we see, okay, we still have 3 requirements. 2 of them were linked to test cases. One of the requirements is linked to a test case that had passed. This is a green sector of this pie chart, and one of the requirements is linked to a test case that has failed. This is the red part of this diagram, and one of the requirements is not linked to any test case at all. This is a gray part. And similar to the test planning report, we see here a table which to which requirement test cases exist, and if they have passed or failed. And we have also a list for each requirement if there's a test case and if it's failed or not. Okay, so this is a primary function of requirements management in TESSY. You can create requirements or import requirements to TESSY. You can create test cases or import test cases to TESSY, and then you can establish a linkage between requirements and test cases. And for the further demonstration, I would like to add some test cases, and you will see for what it is good. The first thing is I duplicate the second test case. I say I copy the test case and I paste it again, and I now get a duplicate of this test case, and I can, for instance, change the name of this test case so that we can clearly distinguish these two. I can make this number 2, and I can make this number 1. And I can also, for instance, change the numbers here and use different test data. Now I have duplicated the second test case. What I also can do, I can create a new test case, and I can give it a name. And you see here that the fourth test case has appeared, and I would like to use the numbers. And now I link this fourth test case to the third requirement, because this test case covers the case of a 0 length of the range, and therefore I link this to here. And then I go back to the test items view, and then I duplicate also the fourth test case, and I copy and I make paste, and I rename it so I can distinguish it. And I do not change the values, or I could change the values. I can make a 6 here, so I have now different test cases. The effect of creating and copying test cases also copies links. This would mean we have linked test case number 2 to requirement number 2, and then we have duplicated it inclusive as a link to the requirements. This means test case number 3 now also links to requirement number 2, and after we have created test case number 4 from scratch, it was not linked. Then we have linked it to requirement number 3, and then we have duplicated test case number 4, including the link to the requirement number 3. If we want to see this in more detail, how the linkage between test cases and requirements are, we can see this in a so-called link matrix. I add all the test cases to the link matrix. I go to the requirements perspective and I add all requirements to the link matrix, and this would show us the linkage between test cases and requirements. You see here in this view here, the first requirement is linked to test case number 1. The second requirement is linked to test case number 2 and number 3, because we have duplicated test case number 2 to test case number 3, including the link we have already established, and then we have test case number 4, which is linked to requirement number 3, and we have duplicated it. Therefore, test case number 5 is also linked to requirement number 3, and this is displayed in the so-called link matrix. You can even export the link matrix to an Excel file or something like this, but I do not want to show this here. The next thing which is important and I want to show you is what happens if new requirements came up after we have everything in place and we have everything executed. We can execute the test cases we have here just to see what happens, and then we can have a quick look in the test execution report to see how it looks after in this new situation. I can generate the execution coverage report, and you see here we have still 3 requirements, and we have 1 requirement where the test case is passed. This is requirement number 1, and we have 2 requirements where we have test cases, but at least some of them failed, and therefore these 2 requirements here are depicted by the red sector. Okay, this is the situation now. Now let's see what happens if new requirements came up. For this, I go to the requirements management perspective and I import again requirements from a file which I already have prepared, and I now use this file and I import it, and you will see what happens. We have now 4 requirements. So this means a new requirement was imported, and 2 of the existing requirements were modified. Requirement number 2 and requirement number 3 were modified. Requirement number 4 is new, and requirement number 1 was unchanged. And I now have to commit the changes, and I commit it, and I call this version 2. And I can look at the differences if I want. I have here a view which shows me the differences of the requirements, and I see here for requirement 1 there's only 1 version available because it has not changed, but for requirement 2 we see here we have 2 different versions of the requirement, and we have, our task is now to find out what are the difference between the 2 versions and which test cases are involved. And TESSY tells us automatically which test cases are involved by the changed requirement. We see also here requirement 3 has 2 versions, so it was changed. So we have to consider requirement 2 and requirement 3. Requirement 4 is new, therefore there's only 1 version which exists. And now TESSY tells us which test cases have become suspicious. Suspicious means these test cases are linked to requirements which have changed, and therefore we have to reconsider if we have to change the test case according to the changed requirement or not. And suspicious is depicted by this small yellow triangle with an exclamation mark inside, and we see that test case number 1 is not suspicious because the requirement number 1 has not changed, but all other test cases are suspicious. Test case 2 is suspicious, test case 3 is and 4 and 5, all the other ones are suspicious. And we have to find out why this is the case and how the requirements differ I select test case number 2, and then I see here, the linked element is requirement number 2, and it has changed in version and text. And I see here a comparison of the two requirements versions, and I can even let TESSY compare the versions. And if I do so, I see the two versions of the requirement side by side, and I see obviously, okay, the version number has changed, that's clear. But for instance, the priority has not changed, and I see here what is the difference between the requirements, and it's that a not was deleted, and this makes the requirement, this is a relevant change, because the requirement now means exactly the opposite what it has meant in the version 1.0. And this means we have to change all the test cases which are linked to this requirement, because the requirement does now mean the opposite of its former version. And if we know that, we can go to the test case, and the expected result for this test case was no, and the requirement has now changed to the opposite, and therefore now the expected answer is yes. And now we have adjusted test case number 2 to the changed requirement. And if we save this and go back to the overview perspective, we see that test case number 2 still is suspicious, but we know we have changed it, and now this test case is conformant to the changed requirement, and therefore we can use this button here which says update link, and if I click on this button, the test case number 2 will not longer be suspicious, because the link between the requirement number 2 and the test case number 2 was now updated and is now in the current state, and I do not longer need to reconsider this connection. And if I click on this link, this button, so the triangle disappears for test case number 2, but it is still present for test case number 3, because test case number 3 is also linked to requirement number 2, but I need to update test case number 3 first prior to making this link current. And if we go and select test case number 3, we see, okay, it is suspicious also because of the change requirement number 2, and we can have a quick look on the differences, and we see it's the same requirements, or there's the same difference. This means the requirement does now mean the opposite what it has meant before, and this means we also need to change the expected result of test case number 3 from no to yes, because the test case now means must test the opposite of its former version. And we can save this, and then we can go back to the overview perspective. We have here now test case number 3 still suspicious, but we have changed the test case, and therefore we are able to use this button here, update link, to also make test case number 3 not longer suspicious. And this is now the case. I have now updated test case number 3, and 2 and 3 are now done. We still have test case number 5 and 4 and 5 suspicious, and we need to see what has happened here. I mark test case number 4, and I see, okay, the two versions of the requirement are different. There's a difference in the text. I do not know exactly what is the difference. I can TESSY direct to show me the differences side by side. And if I look here on this text, I see, okay, this O is replaced by a 0, and is replaced by shall be. This means for me, this requirement has not changed significantly. It means the same. And this means we do not need test cases to change which are linked to this requirement. If we know that, we know that we can make test case number 4 unsuspicious without changing the test case, because the requirement has not changed relevantly. And because it has not changed relevantly, I can use a different button. Instead of update link, I can now use set version semantic equals. This means if I click this button, TESSY will consider the old version of the requirement and the new version of the requirement as equal. And this means all test cases which are linked to this requirement will become unsuspicious at the same time, because I do not need to change these test cases because the requirement has not changed. And this means, and what is different to update link, if I set this requirement semantic equal for test case number 4, it automatically will also make test case number 5 unsuspicious, because it is linked to the same requirement. And yeah, the requirement has not changed significantly, and therefore I can leave test case number 5 as it is. I click now on this button, and this will make both yellow triangles disappear at the same time. This has now happened, and this means now all of our test cases are unsuspicious, and we have handled the new requirements which we have imported. And now we can, for instance, execute all tests if we want, and then we can have a look in the overview report to see, and the test coverage report, and to see what is the current state of the coverage of the requirements to test cases. And we see here now 4 of our 5 test cases pass, and this is reflected in this pie chart. We have 2 requirements for which all test cases pass. These are the green sector here. We have 1 requirement for which at least 1 test case fails, and we have a new requirement, which is not linked to any test case at all at the moment. And this is the requirement number 4, which was imported with the second file, and we have not linked this requirement to any test case. So this requirement number 4 is depicted by the gray sector of this pie chart. And again, we have here lists how everything is connected, and we can study why a certain requirement is fulfilled or not, or whatever. Okay, let's now come to the topic of test means. Let's have a quick look on this slide here. What is a test mean? A test mean for TESSY is something, a method how to check that a certain requirement is fulfilled. TESSY can do unit tests or integration tests, so therefore TESSY is able to check a requirement by means of unit tests or integration tests. And these 2 yellow ones here are predefined by TESSY, but it is possible that you have a requirement which is not possible, for which it is not possible to test it by unit testing or by integration testing, but for instance it's only possible to have a manual check or a review or something like that. And if this is the case, you can get rid of such a requirement in TESSY from the test reports by assigning a different test mean to this requirement. Let's assume that this requirement number 4, which was introduced by the import of the second file, is a requirement we cannot check by unit testing or integration testing, which are the test means predefined by TESSY. This is not the case, but let's assume this 4th requirement refers to something we cannot test in unit testing. And we have here the view test means. 2 test means are predefined by TESSY, and I can add a 3rd requirement, for instance review. I can also give it an abbreviation. The ID will be made by TESSY, and I have now added an additional test mean, and now I'm able to assign a test mean to each requirement. I need a validation matrix for this. I can now introduce a new matrix. This matrix describes the relation between requirements and test means, and I have now here a new view with a for the linkage between requirements and test means. I have these buttons here to add all test means, and I have this button here to add all requirements, and I can now establish the linkage between requirements and test mean. And we have in our example already unit tests for the first requirement, we have already unit tests for the second requirement, and we have already unit tests for the third requirement. Our problem is now the fourth requirement, for which we will not make unit tests, but we won't get rid of this fourth requirement. We say, okay, this fourth requirement is to be checked by a revision, a manual review, and yeah, this is the linkage not to unit test but to review. I can also export this this verification matrix to an Excel file, or I can edit the description, but that's not what I want to do now. Having this linkage established from requirement to test mean, I can redo the coverage report, and I can select for each coverage report which test means shall be considered. And you see here that I have now the new review test mean listed here, and I can say I want in this report only to have the requirements to be considered for which the test mean is unit test. And this means the requirement number 4, for which the test mean is review, will not show up in the report. And you see it now here. We have now only 3 requirements in this report, requirement 1, 2, and 3, and 2 of them have test cases which are passed. One of these requirements has at least one test case has failed. We have here the list, and we see test requirement number 4 is now not longer mentioned in this report, because we look only on requirements where the test mean is unit testing. And this is also here in this lists here. Requirement number 4 does not longer show up. This gives you the possibility, if you get a lot of requirements which are imported from a file, to select only the requirements for the reports which can be checked by unit testing or by integration testing. Okay, this was what I have planned to show you technically with TESSY about requirements linkage. Now, one word to the last topic I promised you. It's about requirements interchange format files. There's a standard available for files which contain requirements, and this file format is called ReqIF, or Requirements Interchange Format Files. And most of the requirement management tools, like for instance STORS or Polarion or whatever you use, most of the tools are able to export the requirements which you have defined by using this tool, to export these requirements in a ReqIF file. And TESSY is able to import such a file with requirements in TESSY, like I have shown you with the import function. And this means you can have all the requirements from your requirements management tool import to TESSY, and then you can use TESSY to link these requirements to test cases, and you can execute tests, and you see if for instance, if a requirement has test cases, if they have passed or failed or not. And this information TESSY is able to export this information, which means how many test cases are linked to a requirement, have these test cases passed or failed, and how many, to export this information to the ReqIF file it has just imported. This means TESSY extends and edits this file, and after TESSY has changed this file, have extended this file by the information about the test cases for a requirement, if your requirement management tool is able to re-import the file it has just exported, you will see the information in the requirements management tool that you will see the information for a requirement, if test cases exist for this requirement, how many, and how many are passed or how many have failed. Okay, so this was what I would like to show you in this webinar. So we have now finished this webinar. We do webinars on a regular basis, and if a new webinar is scheduled, you can see here on this website. We also plan to make a recording of the webinar available on the Hitex web and on YouTube. You can go to this website here, the TESSY website on the Hitex web, and there's a link to webinar recordings, and there you can see also the webinar recordings which are available, and I expect that the recording of this webinar is available in some days also, or you can search in YouTube for this search string here, and this will also lead you to the webinars recording. We have also make them available on YouTube.